I'll make no excuse for this. I think it's a particularly tricky phone-in because the data is quite difficult to get hold of, and also it's really about perceptions. The question is whether corrupt police, police who commit criminal actions, are properly held to account, or whether we just suspect they're always given sort of brushed away and not fully brought to book. It's claimed, I believe, that one police officer is arrested every day on suspicion of criminal offences in this country, ranging from allegations of rape, drug trafficking and sexual offences to fraud and, at the bottom end, I suppose, traffic offences. Going back to 2015, I believe then a total of 1,629 police officers were arrested over the previous 5-year period. Out of these, 500 were convicted or suspended from duty on suspicion of committing offences. And within that statistic is my area of concern. How many were convicted versus how many were suspended from duty? Because to me, a criminal conviction in a court of law is a very, very different proposition from a sort of, you've been told off or suspended from duty. Now, if you go back to 2010, which was 6 years after the Independent Police Complaints Commission was founded, there were concerns then about its effectiveness and independence in actually policing the police. And I think it was the outgoing chair, I think it was Nick Hardwick, and he was quite vocal about the number or the lack of accountability that appeared to apply to serving police officers. Now, we're going to go straight away to Peter Kirkham, former DCI with the Met, just to really because it's so difficult to get a sort of handle on this. Peter, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Lovely talking to you. If I could start first of all with the IPCC, does it do the job that it was set up to do?
It doesn't do it very well.
I hear this a lot.
Because they have failed to develop their own investigators. Part of that is because their bosses a few years ago took the view that using ex-police officers to do their investigations was not a good thing, and so they jettisoned that idea because of the proximity to serving officers. They traded competence for independence.
Right, that makes sense. I understand.
And when they first started, if you look at where are you going to find people with investigative skills for reactive investigations in any sort of volume, the answer is the police service.
Yeah.
And so when they first started, I was actually involved with their training the first time round. There were lots of police officers on secondment, retired officers employed with them after retirement, and that was sort of inevitable to start with. But managerially, they then could have developed their own investigators, because the junior investigators were brought in independently. It was only the senior investigators that were ex-police, and they could have developed those junior investigators into their own senior investigator, but they didn't.
Even allowing for the lack of it, or the lack of competent investigators, for want of a better word. And I know my data is very out of date, but this is going back to when Nick Hardwick was the chair, and I think in 2009, I think it was 31,000 complaints, 88 directly investigated.
Yeah, they've always been totally under-resourced as well, like everything else. In fact, at the moment, they are getting better resourced. At the time, the police are getting reduced resources. So things are improving in that regard. Yeah. The other thing is that we look at these results, and you were talking earlier on about the difference between convictions and suspensions.
Yes.
They're a million miles apart. They're not the same at all.
No.
A suspension from duty is a neutral act whilst an investigation takes place. And then once the investigation has taken place, and in the world of social media, nobody waits for that. They just judge from one side of the story right from the outset. But once the investigation's taken place, the IPCC and or the CPS will decide whether there's enough for any criminal any criminal charges. If so, they take precedence. If there's not, they then review whether there's any evidence for misconduct charges. And if so, they take place. And if the police service doesn't want to follow the recommendations, then in certain serious circumstances, the IOPC can insist on misconduct hearings.
Okay.
However, that has a really checkered history because they have an appalling success rate at those directed hearings. So when you say there's no accountability, I would argue there's actually too much accountability, and they are pushing failing cases that the evidence just isn't there to be seen to be doing something. and then they get the acquittals, the findings of no case to answer at misconduct, and everybody goes, oh, it's a cover-up.
So this is pointing the finger back at the CPS, which I think it would be fair to say over the last couple of years has had a truly horrendous run.
Not really. The CPS apply the same tests that they apply to any criminal case. First of all, is there a realistic prospect of a conviction at a criminal trial? And secondly, is it in the public interest to proceed? Now, normally the second question, there's no doubt about that. So is there enough evidence to succeed? They apply the test. Some would argue that they apply it a little bit more generously in relation to the police, and they prosecute cases that they wouldn't prosecute if it was a civilian member of the public. But the bottom line is they apply the same test that they apply to all cases when they go before the court. So if we're wanting something changing, we're going to say, well, we need to change the rules that apply to police officers and reduce some of the protections and some of the processes that are there for everybody else. And I would very much argue against that.
I know Kevin's dying to get in, but I have a number of neighbours who are in the force, and they always say the line you also hear in movies that the thing that good cops hate most of all is bad cops. Is there a culture of good cops outing bad cops, or is there more a culture of cover-up? There
aren't that many bad cops.
Well, that's a fair point. Yeah.
It depends how you define bad. And I mean, this conversation is in the context of the Bedfordshire case from yesterday. No. Bad as in committing crimes themselves, out and out going committing crimes, doing burglaries on night duty or whatever, of taking money from organised criminals to sell them information or to help them out or to lose the evidence in a case or whatever. That sort of corruption is really bad. No cop would give it the time of day. But those numbers are tiny. I don't know if you remember Paul Condon years ago.
Yeah.
He was going to get rid, and he said there was 250, and I think he found about 80 or something. Even putting huge resources into it. The numbers are tiny. What we're talking about here is a situation where cops have turned up to a routine incident.
This is the Bedford case we're talking about. This is outside a nightclub in which a teenager, Julian Cole, ended up with neck injuries, and I believe, I think at one point, he had cardiac arrest and brain damage.
Yeah, and he's in permanent vegetative state, and it's a tragic incident. But it's a use of force that is done, I'm going to say a million times, it was a gross exaggeration, but loads of times every day. Somebody is creating some sort of a disturbance, quite often around the entrance to or being thrown out of a nightclub or a pub. Force is used to restrain them, taken to the ground, whatever. Unfortunately, in those things, just like in rugby, just like in all contact sports, with all the safety in the world, still some things sometimes go tragically wrong. And what we've got here is we've got officers that didn't set out to injure anybody, didn't set out to do anything wrong, aren't found to have been involved in that injury. They may have been.
But they conspired. They did conspire to provide false accounts of the victim's condition following the incident.
Absolutely. Then it's the cover-up of that, and that quite often is the case. Now, police officers get investigated to the nth degree about that. They get sacked quite rightly. Does that apply to others? Maybe not. Not even in things like the ambulance service or the health service. The level of accountability, investigation of accountability of cops is far higher than anybody else. And, some would argue, and I would subscribe to it to a certain extent, that if you have too much of a blame culture so that officers can't admit honest mistakes, knowing that they're going to be treated fairly, proportionately, supported by their senior officers if they've made mistakes in difficult circumstances, which frequently apply, then they will be tempted to cover things up. And I think we've gone too far down that blame culture route, to be perfectly honest.
Really interesting. Peter Kirkham, former DCI with the Met. Lovely talking to you again. Really, provocative and, food for thought. I will be taking that conversation away with me. Toby Gillies with the headlines next.